This is Matthew McConaughey,
Natalie Portman,
James Patterson,
Michael Ian Black,
and you are listening to
Five Questions
with Dan
Schawbel.
Amy, welcome to Five Questions.
Thank you for having me, Dan.
So I'd like to start off early in your career to really understand what's shaped where you are today and your career choice and path. What role did your mentor, Susan Fisk, play in helping shape your career?
Oh, I mean, an enormous role. I just wouldn't be doing any of the things that I'm doing if not for Susan. She took me on because my undergraduate advisor wrote to her and said, I've got this student who's, really a hard worker. And it was after my head injury. So I was kind of insecure about my abilities at that point. And I didn't have a fancy pedigree. I had gone to a state school. I was from farm country. And she took me on. I feel like she kind of it was a little bit of a crapshoot. I'm sure she gets emails all the time from people saying, I have this student. And she said, okay. So I moved to work with her. And I mean, she's a leader, she's a leader in the field of social psychology, but she's also, one of the foremost experts on the psychology of stereotyping and prejudice and sexism. And so, she was really the best person I could have possibly worked with, but she was devoted to her students. So she had a kind of rule of she didn't take more than one student a year. And so she was never overwhelmed by grad students. She wanted to give each student the absolute best training possible. If I sent her a paper to edit, I had it back the next morning, every single time, for all of those years. That's just unheard of. So she was so devoted. She really felt strongly that her role as an academic was not just as a researcher and teacher, but very much as a mentor, that you are preparing scientists to go out into the world. You should be training them well and just not taking them on if you can't manage it. She was there for me all the time. I cannot say enough. I feel like she should win every mentoring award. And I think that all of her students feel the same way. So but just sort of more specifically, I was a decent writer, but you still have to learn academic writing. And I remember the first time she brought something back to me, she actually walked it to my office and it was full of red ink. And she said, don't be afraid. She said, this is how it's going to work. There will be, more at the beginning, more corrections, and it will get easier. And what she did is she would correct, if I had a habit, of using too much passive voice, she would, underline it and say passive voice, and then sort of rewrite that sentence. She'd do that maybe twice. And then throughout the rest of the manuscript, she'd just say passive voice. So she gives you an example of how to do it, but then you need to figure out how to do it. And, there was less and less red ink over time. That's pretty much how she did everything. It was more sort of heavy handed at first. And then you had to, you learned the process and figured out how to do it on your own. I don't know. She just was a totally devoted advisor. And I feel incredibly lucky.
I think the most powerful thing, or one of the most powerful things in the world, is when people don't have to help you, but they choose to anyways.
That's right.
Because my parents, when I was growing up, they're like, oh, you're special. But it isn't until, for instance, my literary agent had said, I want to work with you, when he didn't have to work with me.
Yeah.
That felt incredibly great. But there's also one other thing that goes along with that, which you probably felt too, is there's a sense of responsibility to live up to those expectations.
Oh my gosh. I mean, when I did something, yes, it's funny. I talk about this very scary moment where I was giving an elevator pitch. I talk about this in my book in the very beginning, to get people to understand what big challenges are, where the stakes feel high and you're being socially judged. I was at this conference that the top grad students are taken to at the end of their 5 years. So they're it's a conference mostly for people who've been in the field for 7 years. And then they take a handful of graduate students who they think will do well in the job market. So you have to have your elevator pitch ready. And I was terrified about this. I got in the elevator sorry. So I literally got into an elevator, going up to the dinner, and there were three like giants in my field in the elevator, and they all like looked at me, and I had like a giant name tag that said like graduate student, and I'm sure they were like, oh, and one of them said, okay, we're in an elevator, give us your pitch. And I started giving this pitch, and everything was gone from my brain. Like the whole pitch was not there. I could not access it. I was so anxious. I was making a plan B, but I kept thinking, I'm going to let Susan down. That's what I was thinking. I'm going to let my advisor down. And it's not that she ever made me feel that way. That's how indebted I felt to her. Like that's how much she gave to me. I really didn't want to let her down.
Yeah, I remember that you were telling that story at a big conference once. I'm like, man, it's just an elevator pitch in general. Even if it was my parents, would be stressful.
Exactly.
So your TED Talk has, at this point, tens of millions of views. You focus on research on body language and psychology. We've entered this kind of new world where, at least around half of people, mostly knowledge workers, are working remote, at least sometimes. How does our body language shape how people perceive us when we're connecting and working remotely? And is this different than in person?
I think a lot of it is the same. You certainly, you can't be like walking around taking up space on a stage as easily. But certainly you're still wanting to convey a combination of confidence and interest, right? You're confident, not overconfident, and you want to be there. And so, you want to avoid body language that's too alpha. That's a turnoff. And you also want to show interest. And the interesting thing is, I think that second piece is where people are really dropping the ball. People are not showing engagement. They kind of feel like they're a student in a classroom of 500 people and the teacher won't notice if they're not paying attention. And I got to say, from teaching big lectures, the teacher notices that one student is not paying attention. And so on these Zoom calls, a lot of times people are so distracted, and you can see them being distracted. They're not invisible. So if they're not able to be present in that meeting, first of all, it's a distraction to whoever is talking. It does not send a respectful or respectable signal. So when that happens to me, I can't help but see that person as a little bit less sort of trustworthy, right? So because they're not listening. So how can I know that they are actually engaged and care about what we're doing? I think it matters. So I think that people, are very worried about looking strong, when what they should be worried about is not worried about, but they should be focusing on showing that they care about being there. I know it stinks. I know that a lot of people want to be meeting in person, but we're not. And so imagine that you are in person and use the body language that you would use in person. That person's still watching you. So that's where I really think people could improve. I'm kind of shocked by it. Like people will pick up their phone or like just be typing or literally just walk out of the room and come back during a meeting with 10 people.
I think you nailed it, though. I think you have to, for interviewing, for working, collaborating, like pretend you are in person, and how would you behave and do that? That's such a good piece of advice. And we did it. My first study during COVID actually was for a sample of thousands of global workers. And one of the big findings was that around trust was that people trust people in physical spaces over remote places. Right. Meaning like, that's good. If you're in person, you're more likely to build trust quicker. There was a whole study by Harvard and the University of Chicago that found negotiators who are in person and shake your hand are more likely to be trusted and win those negotiations because they're in person, and you can look into their eyes and there's a certain level of energy that is conveyed that you can't fully get remotely.
You can't, but knowing that that's already a deficit or a bias, you need to work not less hard, but harder to overcome it.
It's like you're bowling and you have a handicap.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that people need to really be mindful of that.
Absolutely. And we've all gone through our various struggles over the past 2 years, and when I say that, like, obviously, like, I come from a place of privilege. I can work remote. I think working remote, there's a level of privilege when half the workforce are hourly workers and have to be in physical spaces, risking their lives, being essential workers. But everyone has their own struggles. So it's not to say that someone who works remote isn't struggling. People can struggle from loneliness, depression, anxiety, various other things.
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit about what you went through over the past years? Because you, like me, in terms of at least the speaking circuit, very different than it was, before COVID. So aside from career, just overall, like what did you go through and how did you overcome some of those struggles?
I mean, I'm going to talk career first because that was where I was hit the hardest. I think, in-person speaking just was gone, and then it came back a bit this fall, and now who knows what's going to happen next. But that was hard. I love doing that. So it's not just that it was a huge financial hit. I love doing that. It gives me energy. I feel very much energized by being around all those people, talking to them afterwards. It definitely gives me a sense of purpose. So it was hard to hold on to that. At the beginning, because you were involved with this, I was doing that quarantine writing hour where every single weekday I had a best-selling author on talking about how to write. And so for 1 hour, you shared a tip, and then everyone sort of remotely all over the place was writing and would come back, and then I'd have a discussion with the author, as I did with you. And that was wonderful. And I felt so energized. So for about 2 months, I was energized. I was so productive. And then I hit a wall very suddenly. And that's really that depletion of surge capacity, so that's what was getting me through then. And it was happening for a lot of people, was that my nervous system was sort of preparing me to survive in this acutely stressful situation. And so I was like all adrenaline and focus. And then you deplete your surge capacity. So then I really hit a wall. I couldn't really do much of anything very suddenly. And writing was hard. I got to say, writing was hard. I know that you are a very disciplined writer. You're good at just getting at timing yourself, at getting stuff done. I found it very hard because I was writing about two things: public speaking, which wasn't happening, and this work on bullying and bravery. So talking about bullying in a time when people are already feeling pretty bad was hard. It was a little bit too much emotional labor for me. So I had to kind of set that one aside for a little while and come back to it. It's my husband and me and my son, who had just graduated high school, deferred and stayed with us for the year. We were starting to get cabin fever. So we ended up moving to Utah for 7 months, and we just skied all the time. We had to be outside. It was something to do. We had to be active. The only way to be active really was to be outside. We had 2 families who we had a very sort of well-planned COVID bubble with, sort of pandemic bubble. And we hung out with them. And I think that saved our sanity. I mean, to be able to be outside skiing. And then, of course, on March 15th, I tore both my ACLs, but it was my 70th day of skiing. So I got in a lot of skiing.
I mean, that's pretty good. The fact that you only got injured 1 out of 70 days. I get injured the first day I go out. So
that's funny, because I actually do see it that way. I'm like, well, 70 days, that's pretty good before I got injured. So it's been it's up and down. It's back and forth. It's hope, despair, or, maybe not as dramatic now, but it's very tough to manage to manage your expectations right now. And I think I'm not alone in that.
Yeah, and that perfectly segues us into something that you've been writing about. You just wrote an article on the Washington Post, and I think one of the things that we do as, I guess, thought leaders or people who are public figures is we try and stay relevant and try and piece together what's going on in the world with our own unique takes based on our backgrounds and research and everything that we do. You being, focused on various topics with, upcoming books and articles. What is pandemic flux syndrome? Because I haven't heard that before. And how do we get through it?
So pandemic flux syndrome, which is my own term, but it describes how people are coping, I would say in the last 6 months with the constant sort of whiplash of back and forth. Oh, we're reemerging, we're not reemerging, reemerging, not reemerging. That is, I think, taking even a greater toll on just the sort of pandemic. If it had been linear, or just like we're slowly reopening, that would have been fine. But it was that people would get their expectations up and then they'd be dashed and they'd be back home again. And that kind of uncertainty is very unsettling for most humans. Humans like certainty. They want to have a clearly demarcated, fresh start, or like, this is the end of the war. Here, it's Armistice Day. And you're not getting that now. We're not going to get that. There's not going to be a hard and clear-cut end of this. So that's hard. We feel powerless and we lack control. We've lost power and control over a lot of aspects of our lives. And when we feel powerless, it activates what's called the behavioral inhibition system, which, basically makes us see the world as a potentially threatening place. Our focus is not on thriving, but on surviving. We see other people as predators, not as allies. We see as we see challenges not as opportunities, but as threats. We have a scarcity mindset. We better get what we can get now because there's not enough for all of us. We become pessimistic and we don't act because we don't feel that we can change things. So we get frustrated, but we don't do the right things to try to change our situation or improve our situation. And so a lot of us are suffering from that. We also are dealing with, what Dan Gilbert calls affective forecasting errors. And that is our inability to accurately predict how we will feel after big life events. We over predict the length of the emotion and the intensity of the emotion. So 2 examples, when we're looking forward to something good happening, or when you're told, how would you feel if you won $5 million in the lottery? People think they will be a 10 out of 10 on happiness for the rest of their lives. But they come back to their baseline pretty quickly. And so they don't feel quite as happy, and it doesn't last as long. Similarly, we think that we're going to feel much worse after a bad life event and for much longer than we actually do. So when it looked like we were going to reemerge in June, people were so excited. And they'd go to like a 4th of July party or a concert or out to dinner, and they didn't feel quite as happy as they thought they'd feel. And that was unnerving, right? So that was an affective forecasting failure. The flip side of that is that we're actually going to recover more quickly than we think we are. Like now we're feeling pretty bad again, but we have a good psychological immune systems and better than we think we do. So people, when this comes basically to an end, people are going to actually recover faster than they think they will. So I think that, there's a lot of stuff going on. And some people, when we were reemerging, felt actually guilty that they were going to lose pandemic routines that worked for them. So, some people who had remote work situations that were allowing them to do things like take lunchtime walks or spend more time with family, they feel guilty that they liked that part of the pandemic when other people were experiencing great loss. And there's no reason to feel guilty about that. That's what it is. And then finally, I think that people were grieving, but didn't have time to grieve, right? So there was no time to grieve, and there were all kinds of losses. Obviously, people, our own health to some extent for some people, but also just the lack of normalcy, the lack of the way our lives were, the lack of time, a loss of time to be alone. Lots of parents, mothers more so, had very little extra time if they were taking care of young kids or homeschooling all of a sudden. And our surge capacities are just depleted. Our nervous system needs time to refill them. And it hasn't really had a break. We haven't had a break for that to happen. So all of that together is that pandemic flux syndrome. It's that, it's the roller coaster that we're on right now.
I think that's a great analysis. It makes me reflect. Basically, I've done some research over the past few years about people feeling stuck. So
Uh-huh.
if we think about what it meant to feel stuck in
Yeah.
general in 2020, it was people stuck in their jobs, hoping they didn't get laid off or furloughed,
Yeah.
willing to not get a promotion, not get a bonus, maybe take a pay cut. So
Yeah.
it wasn't from a career standpoint feeling stuck from a career standpoint, meaning like too afraid to move because you're just happy to have the job you have to be able to feed yourself and your family.
Right.
Whereas in 2021, which is fascinating, is, over 20 million people quit their jobs. So, compare and contrast 2020 to 2021, like incredible economy, perhaps arguably the best economy in my lifetime, right? With, 11 million unfilled jobs in America, or more. And compared to last year, which was a very deep recession. But this year, people feel just as stuck.
No.
And they're stuck in their career because there is too many options, because they're still kind of like you were saying, trying to process everything that's happened over the past year, right? It's always been go, 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 go.
Yeah.
There hasn't been a process. It's almost really smart, use an example of where you're living in Utah skiing, like that kind of gets you away from everything. So you could at least somewhat try and process what's been going on, but not everyone got to do that.
No,
And so
and that we
it's
were
kind of lingered on
incredibly
it.
lucky to be able to do that.
So regardless of the job market, regardless of the opportunities, you can still be stuck. I think that
Oh,
was something that
absolutely.
I saw over the past 2 years.
And I think to some extent the great resignation or the big quit, or I know there are lots of words for it, but this pattern is, and I wrote about this last week in the Washington Post, is also being fueled a bit by people's desire to reclaim power, right? Quitting is an action that's decisive and that immediately impacts your life, right? So you feel like you can't impact your own life. Well, you can by doing this. And for some people, that's great. And for other people, it may not be great. It might give you a surge of feeling powerful in the moment, but 6 months later, you may be at a power deficit again. So it's complicated, right? People leaving and staying still both feel stuck in some ways.
Absolutely. And what's your best piece of career advice?
Mine is, you have to stay open to the opportunities that come your way that you don't know are coming your way. If you don't feel like you are doing exactly what you want to be doing, you better keep yourself open. You might have a conversation with somebody, that you expect to just be chit chat that ends up piquing your interest and leading to an opportunity that you had never considered before. So my best advice is stay open, remain open to opportunities that you haven't thought of yet. And you may first hear them and it doesn't seem like something you want to do. But the people who have I think the most fulfilling careers are those who, took a lot of turns, and mostly because they met people who suggested something to them or presented an opportunity to them. So don't feel like you have to, just because you chose a path, that doesn't mean you have to stay on that path forever. There are lots of little offshoots that might be better for you. So stay open.
In fact, how many people actually stay on that path forever? Like you could
Exactly.
try and stay on that path forever, but it's like everyone has a plan and then they get punched in the face. Like Mike Tyson says, like you
Yeah.
think that things are going to work out and then there's a shift. Like
Exactly.
we just said, like the speaking world completely changed. So you have to shift to digital and you got a ring light and you figured out how to deliver a keynote remotely. And that's, these are new skills that you're building. So I think that, what you're saying is spot on. Like we have to be able to adapt and constantly adapt. It's not like just for one day. This is forever now. We're always going to be in the state of influx that you described.
Exactly. And I've been saying it's not resilience. Like resilience is returning to your pre-crisis state. But being agile, being able to adapt, that's staying strong and also changing with the circumstances. And we do have to accept that flux is going to be part of our future. And what can we learn about ourselves through this experience that we apply when things calm down a bit?
Well, that's great advice. And thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, Dan.